A powerful voice from inside the U.S. administration trying to reassure Ukraine and its allies that support within the United States remains strong also in the political realm, and that support is bipartisan. We're now, well, unfortunately, Ukraine's opponent, Russia, is not without its friends in the world either. Our next session is going to look at the Sino-Russian axis and what that means. It's going to be moderated by a very capable person. Florence Gaub is going to be familiar to many of you. She is director of the research division at NATO's Defense College, and I should mention that this session is brought to you in partnership with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung of Germany. The floor is yours. A warm round of applause for your moderator.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to bring you this afternoon a discussion on a relationship that many people underestimated. I'm gonna be breaking a little bit the Chatham House rule here. If I tell you that 3.5 years ago at the Munich Security Conference, I assisted to an event that was called "What if Russia and China became allies?" It was off the record, so technically I cannot tell you who said what, but suffice it to say that all the Asians and Russians in the room were sure that that alliance already existed, and all the Westerners in the room thought it will never happen, which to me indicated that we're having a major perception problem. One of the two has to be wrong. So, of course, fast forward 3.5 years later, COVID and Ukraine, I think we're a bit wiser, but perhaps still not wise enough. So I'm pleased to discuss this and other questions related. To my right, Dietmar Nietern, who is an MP from Germany. To his right, the only Russian in the room, or perhaps almost the only Russian in the room, Vladimir Milov, who is from the Russian opposition. To his right, Teresa Fellon, a well-known voice. She's a director of the Center for Russia-Europe, but basically you are just Teresa Fellon, no matter where you work. And to her right, Tobias Ellwood, who's an MP from the United Kingdom. So, Vladimir, since you are one of the few Russians attending this conference today, I thought I'll give you the privilege to start this conversation. Would we discussed a bit earlier, you think you have a bit of a more nuanced vision. I think we're now seeing in Europe or in the West in general this fear that Russia and China are going to become best friends, and what does it mean for us? You're saying it's a bit more nuanced than that. Can you elaborate?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here. Yes, it is indeed more nuanced, and Putin and Xi Jinping, they would like you to believe that they're best friends, and they maintain this firm alliance against the West. However, this is what you see on surface, and I really worked a lot beneath the surface. When I used to be in the Russian government 20 years ago, I used to work a lot with Chinese on different energy projects, and talked to them ever since, and I also know a lot of people in the Russian government, and I know what they think. So there's this deep level of distrust. I won't go into, this insider conspiracy formulas, but I would refer to just a very recent quote by one of the most influential Russian policymakers, Mayor of Moscow, Sergei Sobyanin, who spoke at the Moscow Financial Forum just a few days ago and made a lot of headlines saying that the East, and China in particular, are no less waging an economic war against Russia and are much tougher partners than the West was, because they are only interested in selling their manufactured finished products at a premium, taking our mineral resources with huge discount, and not agreeing to any technology transfer, because Russians say we only need some critical technologies and components that we are missing, but Chinese saying no, no technologies, no components, buy a finished product. By the way, on average, when China became a major supplier of passenger cars to Russia, 92% of imports now are Chinese. Prices surged 50% upwards. as compared to cars imported from Europe or Korea or Japan. So that's roughly the nature of economic relationship. And I think also there's big distrust among the elites. To my best knowledge, Chinese elite perceives Russian elite as unworthy, corrupt, and not acting in national interest. I've seen many signs that they heavily despise current Russian rulers. And Russian elite perceives China as a country which will someday, if things develop as they do now, will swallow Russia. So the level, I mean, if you scratch that surface of a global alliance, they still need each other to act together against the collective West, because they see democratic rule-based order and Western democracy as a lifestyle as a major existential threat. Because their own people might want the same thing in their own countries, so that is an existential threat. So this is why they are forced to act together, and they will do a lot of stuff together. But I can go on for hours, but I'll finish here by saying that beneath that surface there's deep distrust, not truly converging, but often opposite interests and so on. So we got to see a lot of nuance in this relationship.
You know, I mean, also marriages with distrust can also survive for a long time. So the question to me would be, you want to come
until they explode at some point.
Tobias, there is a lot of hope in some quarters that China can act as a as a deterrent against Russia in Ukraine. And I don't know if any of you saw the article in the Washington Post. I think it was in February. China and Ukraine signed actually a friendship treaty in 2013, whereby which China would protect Ukraine in case of a nuclear attack. We haven't heard about this treaty in a long time. At least China hasn't mentioned it very much. Do you think China is still a diplomatic power we could use in this regard, or just let's forget it and move on?
I think that's an important question. China is clearly wanting to exert its influence, not just in Ukraine, but across the world. I mean, stepping back from this, I think we're at a juncture that we're still in denial. From my perspective, I see the world splintering into two spheres of dangerously competing influence, with a lot of countries perhaps taking a back seat to see where this is all going to go, many in the global south. We're at a juncture in our history which we really don't know how to handle. Without being too sensationalist about it, you know, historians like to bracket history. So the Treaty of Westphalia saw a set of rules come out from that. The victor sets the rules. That lasted so long until arguably the Treaty of Utrecht. That lasted so long until the Napoleonic Wars. We had the Vienna Congress. That lasted so long until the Treaty of Versailles after the First World War. League of Nations. Now, then we had the Bretton Woods World War II. And we are now testing the limits of what we now call the international rules-based order. We are heading towards crisis mode because those rules that we wrote back in 1945 are no longer relevant for today, because powers have grown, alliances have developed, countries are weaponizing, and we are too perhaps risk-averse to recognize how weak the United Nations, which we look at the custodians for international security, have become. So China can now step into this to take advantage, because we don't know which way to face and what to do. Why people consider today a 1930s feel as to the way the world is actually going.
Very, very gloomy prospects. But Theresa, can you help us find an avenue for action? I mean, you're very critical of how, well, we Europeans, Westerners have handled all of this. What would you propose if I gave you 5 minutes, I don't know, let's say with the American president or anybody in Europe who you think has influence? What would we have to do to make sure that they don't get closer? Is there even any way to disentangle this relationship between China and Russia, or you're saying the ship has sailed? Is there any hope?
First of all, thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be here and on this wonderful panel. I feel after we had a morning round table, and it was really helpful for me to hear these voices in the room about, largely French voices, about a third way, that somehow Europe can kind of maybe pull China away from Russia or pull Russia away from China. And I'm sorry, this is, yeah, okay, I lived in Russia from 98 to 2003, and then immediately moved to Beijing from 2003 to 2007. And this experience was so interesting for me because many people, when they move to China, they don't see Soviet influence. But if you live in Moscow for 5.5 years and you move to Beijing, all you see is Soviet influence. So that relationship was so important. It was one of the biggest technological transfers in history. You see in the architecture, you see it in a lot of the traditions. And after about 3 months, it started to wear off. And I was in Moscow at a time when it was kind of negative, and the one thing about moving to Beijing was very positive. People every year of their life got better after the Cultural Revolution, and that's not the case anymore. So they have a lot of inner problems. But what I want to go to is like 1989, and we saw the fall of the Berlin Wall. But that same year, June 4th, was Tiananmen Square. So everyone's like, yay, the world, end of history, everything's done. But we kind of ignored what was going on in the People's Republic of China. And let me make it clear, I had such a positive, good experience in China. It's the Chinese Communist Party I have a bit of trouble with, not the people. So I think what we really have to keep in mind is that we got our eye off the ball, and we helped. There's a saying, we thought if we fed the baby shark, it would grow up into a dolphin. And now we have a killer shark, and what are we going to do with it? So we've enriched it, and now it's this incredible peer competitor of the United States. It's challenging Western values. And in the leaked document number 9, it's made very clear all of these things, democracy, rule of law, all of these things are a threat to the Chinese Communist Party. And the main thing for Xi Jinping is to control, to make the world safe for the Chinese Communist Party. And now we're seeing him make some interesting choices of security over economic growth. And this is a new narrative because many European businesses, many American businesses, they're having to deal with a raft of contradictory rules and regulations that make it almost impossible to do business in China, uninvestable. So now let's also remember what happened in 1989. Gorbachev was invited by Deng Xiaoping to visit Beijing. And then there was the student protests, and it became almost embarrassing for Deng Xiaoping. But why did Deng reach out to Gorbachev? He was trying to pull the Soviet Union into, to improve relations. And what's happened in history, I think a lot of people, maybe Kissinger is very good, at selling himself. But in 1961, there was already I call them reverse armchair Kissingers, this idea of agency that we can flip Russia-China relations. But in 1961, they already had a separation, right? And then Kissinger came in, or Nixon's visit was in 1972, so there's already a delay of 11 years. So it wasn't that Kissinger magically pulled China away from the Soviet sphere of influence. So we have to keep that in mind, especially when we have this idea of pulling one away from the other. They see the West as a threat. They have common convergence of interests. In addition, let's look at the map, folks. Russia and China share a huge border. And I would say one of the turning points was in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. So if you look at the early Belt and Road Initiative maps, this kind of signature foreign policy of Xi Jinping, it went around Russia. After 2014, they knew they had to pull Russia into the tent, otherwise Russia would stop every area of them to kind of move with their foreign policy plan. So you saw this map kind of go up to Moscow and then out again. So Ukraine was a huge anchor in China's strategy on the Belt and Road Initiative. So we're seeing all of these threads coming together. And I would say that, the Chinese have a saying, if you you cannot wake up a person who's pretending to be asleep. Now, all this kind of magical thinking that maybe Russia and China aren't together, I think Florence gave such a good example that even, countries in the region could see this. Countries more in the Indo-Pacific could see this type of cooperation. And in any marriage or any even transatlantic relations, there are areas of friction. But in China-Russia relations, it's so bad now for Russia that the two areas that everyone thought this is a no-go zone, we're seeing increased cooperation now in the Arctic, and that has implications for people here in Europe. In addition, if Russia gets into such a bad economic state, China will ask, I'm sure they're always asking, and China or Russia might be able to put them off a bit, but more high-level tech cooperation, especially in advanced nuclear submarines. So we're now seeing them do cooperation in the Arctic, and I think this is a big wake-up call for all of us. China's not far away; it's going to be right here in our neighborhood.
Can I just jump on that and ask Dietmar? Actually, sorry, you are German, so you'll have to, kind of speak for Germany in that sense. Since we're talking tech, and Germany was, I think, one of the driving forces in setting the tone on China in the EU due to all these business interests. Do you think we're having a similar wake-up moment in Germany as we had on Russia 2 years ago, or are we still, I'm not going to say naive, but still hoping for a scenario that might not materialize?
I would say that, of course, in a very differentiated political system, we have also, until today, policymakers who are perhaps very naive in their looking to China. But the overwhelming majority waked up, not only because of that what happened with the imperialistic war from Russia against Ukraine, because of the question, are we Europeans, not only we Germans alone, are we able to protect, to defend our European way of life in the next decades? And we must see that not only Russia, Russian imperialism, that also China with a clear long-term agenda is not only a partner, it is in some issues, of course, a competitor, but it's a rival. And because of that, we launched a new China strategy. And we discuss it now in the parliament and with NGOs. And I think we must learn, not only we Germans perhaps at first, to think as China in long terms. We have, in a time where you can order everything by Amazon in 24 hours, a lot of us are not able to think in very long terms. And we must do that regarding China. And that means, for me, to set one example, security is more important than economic growth, is not in the interest of the global south. And we have more and more countries in Africa who are telling us it was a mistake to set our hopes only on China. We had short wins, but in the long run we think we should think about if it would not better if we cooperate with you. And I think it's not only Russia-China, it's not only to come into an economic war with China, it's coming to make a smart policy looking to the complete world and to think what can we do that we find more and more countries, even countries who are not ruled by democratic systems, who think that a rule-based world order, even in a Western style, is in the long run better for them as to be only dependent on China. And I think building these new coalitions and making Europe resilient in the way that we find a way to be not dependent in technological issues and others from China, this kind of strategy should be now worked out and, of course, should be implemented.
Vladimir, you know Russia from the inside much more than most of us, perhaps with the exception of Theresa. So, the problem the fear that we have is that, Russia has the military power, has the diplomatic know-how, China has the economic power, and obviously has a type of, I would say, developing a method to use technology to control its population. And the fear is that when these two forces merge, when one has what the other has, then we indeed have a very difficult, dangerous mix. Would you say that Russia is learning domestically from China? I mean, perhaps in terms of how to control a population economically, or do you think there is no influence domestically to be felt?
There is some influence, definitely, and I would say it's broader than just Russia-China axis, because you see that this international cartel of dictators, they constantly exchange what business calls best practices, I would call worst practices of totalitarian control over society. They really interact, and I would say, if not that, many of the dictatorships in the past 20 years would have fell. in Venezuela, Belarus, Syria, and Russia, probably. So this inter-exchange of techniques of how to control of this, their societies is really going on. However, I have to say, the interests between Russia and China are fundamentally different. Because China, no matter what, China greatly benefited from the current rule-based international order. Russia hasn't. We can talk about the reasons for that.
Please develop. How has China benefited and Russia hasn't?
40 years of uninterrupted economic growth because of access to international markets, because of technology transfer, investment, and introduction of the basics of market capitalism. Sorry to say that. It works. Russia tried to introduce that, but these waves crashed against the stones of ineffectiveness of Russian system, corruption, and inability of the society to break through that. So Russia have chosen, which I think to me was a deviation from a normal pattern, but it's a long discussion. Russia has chosen to become a disruptor. China is fundamentally not a disruptor. It is, of course, interested to have Russia doing things which it cannot afford to. Like, you know, in the chaotic 1990s when a lot of business relations were settled through involvement of banditry. When negotiations were tough, some of the businessmen said, if you misbehave, I'm going to call the bandits. This is how Xi Jinping uses Putin to threaten the West, saying that, listen, whom I got, if you don't negotiate the new world order with me, I have this guy who has no limits, right? So Xi Jinping needs Putin for that. But fundamentally, China is not interested in disruption. It is interested in finding some common ground with all the international players, the West, and so on. This is why there is very little that Russia's disruptive behavior can fundamentally, strategically bring to China in terms of its future development, progress, and solving all the multiple problems that emerged in the recent years.
If you allow me, Tobias, to use this statement by Vladimir and throw a speculative question to you, but what do you think is China learning from the war on and in Ukraine at the moment? Obviously, everybody's thinking Taiwan, but I'm thinking more generally, because we talk a lot about what if Ukraine loses, what it means for the rules-based international order, etc. But there are also other, I think, effects on China already. Free to speculate.
Yeah, I think China is absolutely benefiting from this war in Ukraine. It's distracting all of us. The majority of this forum here, maybe because of our geography in Eastern Europe, has focused on Ukraine and European matters. But these bigger geopolitical questions are something that should be dominating every single parliament, every single democracy across the world, including the United Nations, which is now paralyzed because of 2 permanent members of the Security Council are able to block everything. So it's clear that China has a grand geopolitical strategy. The West doesn't. And China has recognized that it needs Russia as a convenient friend to advance its interpretation of our wobbly rules-based order for its own benefit. It wants to expand its influence. It needs to, because in order to feed that huge economy that has done so well, because we've been quite liberal with our rules and not enforcing them, it now needs to have all these tentacles through its One Belt, One Road programs and so forth in order for China to advance. And Russia conveniently helps with that because of the oil and gas, for example. It's not even, but there is a sort of symbiotic relationship there. Both elites in Moscow and Beijing enjoy the fact that they are untouchable, if you like, from the West. Rules-based order doesn't suit any dictator. Transparency, democracy, openness, fairness, and so on. These aren't things that Russia wants, neither or Moscow and Beijing want. So they are gagging up, if you like, to challenge where we are. For me, the high tide point of Western liberalism after the Second World War was probably Afghanistan. Maybe the Berlin Wall. That's when we became complacent, when we became too relaxed about recognizing what we believe in, what we defend, what we're willing to stand up for to protect the international rules-based order. But the real clinch was Afghanistan, when we decided to pack it all in after 20 years. And I think that was a signal to Russia to say the West hasn't got it in them. And it was their green light to then invade Ukraine. And this is where we are. This is going to be China's century. There's no doubt about it, the way it's growing. Now, internally, there's questions about whether it will last, whether it could implode and so forth. I think there's an awful lot of speculation there. What China is doing is asserting its way of life on many, many countries around the world, its influence, being able to close countries down to their ability to express their views, whether it be at the UN or even at the Human Rights Council in Geneva. Russia has just applied to rejoin the Human Rights Council in Geneva. And how could that possibly be? But they will probably get membership simply because the numbers there will support that. That shows you the chaotic place that our world currently is. We're still in this space of denial and understanding where we need to go. But we also need an off-ramp. We need to recognize that China is not going away. It is absolutely massive. So how is it, and I think economics is the answer here, you put the G7 plus the EU and other countries, like-minded nations together, you get over half the world's GDP. But are we forceful enough to actually encourage recognition of the rules that we operate from when we do trading, when we've been so lackluster, so timid in making sure that China operates from those same rules? That, for me, is the answer that avoids potential conflict or a bump, if you like, between the big two superpowers that we have now, the United States and China, somewhere further down in our century.
Teresa, can I also invite you to speculate, referring to you who has lived in China, referring to that treaty of friendship between Ukraine and China, which promises protection to Ukraine from China in case of a nuclear attack. Do you think, so here's again speculation, do you think that Xi Jinping and Putin ever talk about that? And Xi says, could you not do that? Because then I would have to respond, and if I didn't respond, then actually that would look bad? Or do you think this treaty is just conveniently being forgotten and Russia has carte blanche? My question is, what would have to happen for the two to at least have some type of rift diplomatically at the international level? What would Russia have to do in Ukraine so that China has to distance itself a bit?
It's 19 months, almost into the war. If China was going to do something, they would have done it by now. So I think this is magical thinking. The 1991 agreement that the People's Republic of China signed has been conveniently forgotten. They've signed many agreements in regard to other states in Asia, and those are being ignored. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, they also ignore. So this is just another example of, they can sign anything. They've signed an agreement on non-export of European data, but I think most people would agree that that's being ignored. So I don't think, they're transactionalists and they're mercantilist, and it suits their purposes to look the other way. Ukraine was a very good partner of China. They got their first aircraft carrier from Ukraine. They got special technology that Russia wouldn't sell them. They even trained PLA soldiers in Ukraine. So when push came to shove, China just kind of forgot all about that, and Russia was there, and that was more to China's interests and benefits. So I've talked to some Chinese officials, and I asked them, it's kind of being handcuffed to a corpse. How are you going? You're losing Europe because of your close relationship with Putin. And you know what the response was? Well, you know what's going to happen at the end of the war in Ukraine? We can rebrand ourselves, and we're going to help rebuild Ukraine. Now, we don't know what the outcome will be in Ukraine, but China is so confident that people will have amnesia, forget all about this, and just think, wow, you're helping lift the burden and rebuilding Ukraine. And let's face it, the Chinese are really ideologically driven. They believe, the idea of Mackinder, this let me just quote this. Since we are in Central and Eastern Europe, whoever rules Eastern Europe will rule the heartland. Whoever rules the heartland will rule the world island. And whoever rules the world island will rule the world. The Chinese really believe this. So we came up, they came up with the 17+1. It's shrunk down to 14+1. The Chinese learned a very important lesson: never call any organization by a number, because then it's a barometer of who's in, who's out. But I would say that this is a golden opportunity for China to get in there and build like a panopticon, Chinese surveillance mechanisms, smart cities. There's no guarantee how the future will turn out. We've already learned about the secret police stations that have been all over Europe. China just sees what they can get away with. And are we going to be alert to what's going on right in the heart of our neighborhood here in Europe? And I also, just to pick up on your point about sanctions, It's been an incredible stress test. Beijing has had a ringside seat to see how the world responds to sanctions on Russia. And effectively, Russia has been able to get around just about everything. China has bought Russian oil that's helping Putin pay for his war in Ukraine. And also, we see China is fearful of secondary sanctions, but there's growing evidence that they are selling dual-use goods to Russia, that they are supporting them any way they can. And in addition, the Russian Duma, the second highest-ranking Chinese Communist Party official, spoke at the Duma and said, "We will help you undermine Western sanctions." So the Russian Duma then leaked the tape to show the world that China was going to support them to undermine Western sanctions, but then the Chinese hoped that no one else would notice. So they tell different audiences different things. And I'm sure with the Europeans, they tell them wonderful, wonderful things, because their goal is to drive a wedge in the transatlantic alliance. But I think we really have to live in the world as it is, not as what we would like it to be, and we are really facing a huge challenge.
Dietmar, if I can come back to you, and especially, you just mentioned the new China strategy. Can you tell our audience a little bit what you think is new about it? Of course, the fact that there is one that's new, but what are elements in it that you think show that Germany is entering a new course on China?
First of all, I think Germany tries to get a sufficient strategic geopolitical approach. And we are throwing back from, with good economic relations, we get trust and we can do something for good with China. So that's a change. And to speak out clear that it's also a rival. The second thing is that we say we want to see it at the complete map of the world. We need new strategic partnerships. To say it clear, we have heard a lot of analysis of the threats of China and Russia, but I think we should think about what's to do that these threats will not again threats that will change our policies, and therefore we need new alliances. I think that the new president of Brazil don't want to live under Chinese rule. He says some stupid things about Ukraine, but he is not a completely anti-Westerner. We must work together with countries like China. We must work more together even when we have an Hinduistic, nationalistic government with India. And India don't want to live under the rule of China. But if we think only the West, Europe, Canada, the US, Japan, Australia can manage it, we will fail. We must change ourselves in our view of the world, and we must cooperate even with some dictators, even with some countries who are not completely democracies, and we must build strategic alliances of a majority, not only GDP, of countries who think that a rule-based world that is not under Chinese rule is in the long run good for them. And I think we can build such alliances. And we must start now with that. And if you see, as Chancellor Scholz invited other countries to the meetings of G7 when we had the presidency, that's the right way. But if we think the West can manage it alone to stop China, we will fail. And we must change ourselves. We must talk about things we perhaps do not like with India, for example, with Brazil, for example. That's, for me, the right approach.
Thank you. I think what people also forget is that China is now number 2 in terms of diplomatic representations in the world. But if the Europeans got all their act together, then of course we would be, well, number 2, if not even number 1, just in terms of diplomatic representations. Vladimir, I want to give you the last, the last word. Is there one wish you could express now when it comes to this relationship from us, if we want to term us as the West? What is it that you think we should be doing? What do you think we should not be doing?
Oh, it's very hard to limit this to just one wish, but
we have only 3.5 minutes.
We have been saying, me and my friends, late Boris Nemtsov and others, 20 years ago, we have been visiting all the Western capitals and saying, do not overlook the violations of human rights and the crackdown on freedoms in my country, because the lawlessness will not stop at home. It will be exported. So you see that the tightening of control over society in China is expanded further into Spratly Islands, into threats against Taiwan, and generally significantly more expansionist policies that China never showed in the past 30 years. That is connected. That is connected. So these, bloodthirsty dictators, they do not stop at crackdown at home, which means I understand all this difficult geopolitical balancing, but don't overlook the human rights situation and freedom and democracy issues, because ignoring them results in aggressive expansionist policies by dictators. China is no exception.
I thank you very much. Please, dear audience, join me in an applause to my fantastic 4 panelists, and thank you for being here today.